Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Hammer Down Ranked, where we rank the albums from some of my favourite bands. If you are new here, please do subscribe to the channel, it really does help us out. Today's bands that we're going to be rating the albums for is Australian metalcore band Buried in Verona. Now, Buried in Verona come out of that amazing scene of Australian metalcore bands who, for whatever reason, Australians seem to do metalcore the best. Bands like Parkway Drive, North Lane, Amity Affliction, In Heart's Wake, there's loads of them, but Buried in Verona are a little bit less well-known one that I wanted to delve into today as one of my personal favourite bands. So, they were formed back in 2007 in Sydney, Australia, and much like a lot of bands, the typical high school meeting of members. Brett Anderson, not to be confused with Brett Anderson of Suede, who are actually from my hometown here in England, Mick Taylor, Scott Richmond, Steve Rogers, and Katonga Chituta. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, hope I am. They released 5 albums over the course of a pretty tumultuous career, and we're going to be delving into each record and discussing why the band are no longer around at the end of the video. So, in number 5, we have the second album from Buried in Verona, 2010's Saturday Night Sever. For this second record, the band decided to follow compatriots like Parkway Drive in moving to record the record overseas, and actually recorded this album in Stockholm in Sweden. Pretty generic metalcore album cover. It's a pretty good one. Gives me A Day to Remember Homesick vibes. I love that style of album cover. Clearly a lot of effort was put into that album art. But overall for me, this is not a particularly fantastic album. There's a couple of highlights in there. Classics like Hanging Hose by Their Toes, which goes down as one of Buried in Verona's biggest songs. Another good track on the album is The End. But overall, there's plenty of tracks on this album that I'm just not really a massive fan of. It's very generic, dirty, raw metalcore, which a lot of people love, and a lot of people would later go on to criticise them for leaving that sound. But for me, just not a huge fan, so that's why it gets my number 5 spot. So moving on to album number 4, the debut album, 2008's Circle the Dead. So much like Saturday Night Sever, this is a raw, punchy, aggressive album. To me, this one does it slightly better because it's actually less well recorded, more aggressive, more intense. Although this type of raw, aggressive metalcore isn't really for me, I think Circle the Dead does it better than Saturday Night Sever. It's immature metalcore in the best possible way. Blunt Magazine, after the release of this album, put them into the top 25 bands to look out for list, so clearly there was some potential there. Now already there's going to be a big theme of this running through this list, but there were some member changes right at the beginning here. In particular, Steve Rogers having a severe back injury, which meant that he had to unfortunately leave the band, although that sounded like it was quite a dramatic situation at the time. He was eventually replaced by Chris Melross. Some good tracks on this album, Don't Call Me Baby and Taken to the Light. Those are my personal 2 favourites of the album, but once again, very clear distinction that it's not my favourite record in the world. Now, what's interesting here is those first 2 albums have a very distinctive, classic, filthy metalcore sound, a lot of breakdowns, some very raw vocals, and the 3 albums that follows, partly because of all of the member changes, I imagine, way more mature, very different bands. They're almost like 2 completely different bands, and the latter 3 records for me, insanely good albums. But before we go into that, we're going to talk about my shirt of the week, and it is Bleed Again. Now, Bleed Again, one of the South Coast's most prominent metalcore bands. They've been around the block for a little while. In 2021, they released the album Resurgence, and that for me is their finest body of work. They have released stuff before that, 2017's Momentum, and an EP between the 2. Now, there is new music dropping this year. In fact, there's a single that is literally about to be released on June the 7th. So if you're watching this after June the 7th, it has been released. I've heard it. It's awesome, so definitely go and check it out. Bleed Again are absolute experts at what they do. It also helps that they're some of the nicest guys I know, extremely professional, fantastic on stage. I've booked them several times for Hammerdown. They're playing Hammerdown Festival this year. They've also headlined 2 of our Hammerdown warm-up shows in the past. They're also going to be playing the Hammerdown Winter Militia on the 7th of December, so definitely check that out. But the reason that now is a great time to talk about them is because they've recently just been announced to headline the Takeover stage at Download Festival, a massive deal for any up-and-coming band. So this will certainly elevate their careers, and watch this space. Bleed Again are about to skyrocket. So go and check them out. I'm obviously going to leave some links to some of their stuff in the description of this video. Follow Bleed Again, listen to the 2021 album Resurgence. But enough of that. We're going to be now talking about the top 3 albums from Buried in Verona, which is of course the reason why you clicked on this video. So in number 3, we've got 2012's Notorious. Now, before the release of this record, unfortunately, member changes were all over the place. Mick and Kat were both replaced by Sean Ginn and Nate Martin. Now, with all of these changes in lineup, naturally the musical style style was going to change, and they even disclosed that in some interviews. Scott Richmond, the bassist of the band, shortly before the album, was also replaced in the band by Daniel Ginn. Now, this was announced on social media as, unfortunately, Scott being far too much of a party animal, ending up going through a glass window and really hurting himself. Now, this was just before a tour with the Amity Affliction, which is obviously a huge deal to them. That was going to be all across Australia, so they had to find that replacement very quickly. They also ended up touring Europe with Life Ruiner and ended up signing to UNFD, which is one of the big boy labels for this kind of music, especially down in Australia. To me, this was an incredibly important move because this gave them stability and backing in a time when the lineup had changed so much that Brett Anderson, not the Suede one, was the sole founding member left in the band. So this, as well as Aaron from Amity Affliction featuring on the song Can't Let It Go, certainly helped to give the band a boost and that stability that I mentioned. And actually, this album made it to 20 in the Australian charts. It was also nominated for Best Album in the ARIA Australian Awards. And another major hit for a band that clearly had the talent to do well was that another major record label over in the States, Artery Recordings, signed them for the US side of their business to give them representation in the biggest market of all. After the album was released, there was another drummer change, and new drummer Connor Ward featured on the standalone single and music video for I Am Hate. Now, this album has 3 or 4 of my top 10 favourite ever Buried in Verona songs. Miles Away, insane chorus. Can't Let It Go, same. Perceptions, which is a beast of a song. And most importantly, Lionheart, which has gone on to become a pretty legendary song from the band. Lionheart is a very deep take on emotional connections with Brett's father, and I assume him not being around very much. The lyrical content is pretty aggressive, pretty heartfelt, and pretty honest. And I have to say, this whole album is an excellent piece of work. Really stunning album, and shows how much talent that this band had. But then we move on to album number 2. It just keeps getting better because in 2014 they released the album Faceless. The first single, Splintered, came out on the 28th of November 2013 to rave reviews. On January 22nd they released Illuminate, which had their best music video so far, most professional, and an awesome song as well. Now, this was their best charting album and made it to 15 in the Australian album charts, but that didn't stop the absolute tidal wave of member changes as more occurred during this album cycle. The album starts with Eclipse, which is an epic song. Songs like Set Me On Fire, The Damned and The Faceless absolutely carry that album into being one of the best albums the band ever ended up making. Overall, this album was better recorded, way more professional. The song structures had come a long way from those first 2 albums, and generally speaking, I think this album is a pretty awesome body of work. But the number 1 album, the final album from Buried in Verona, 2015's Vultures Above, Lions Below. The first single on this album was Can't Be Unsaid, which was a way softer song, way more emotional, similar to songs like Lionheart, I suppose. And it came with a very mature music video. And in fact, this album came with several very mature and very well put together music videos, including those for Hurricane, which is one of my favourite songs ever, not just from Buried in Verona, ever. And of course, Extraction. There was a lot more emphasis on effects in this album as well. This album puts a lot more emphasis on clean vocals. Songs especially like Can't Be Unsaid and Hurricane contain a lot more slower, clean vocals, something that the band was actually incredibly good at. It also puts a lot of emphasis on a lot more electronic effects, especially in the opening song, Vultures Above, and also in Done For Good. They also, in my humble opinion, absolutely mastered metalcore gang vocals, and I think, alongside While She Sleeps, I think Buried in Verona are the absolute pinnacle of gang vocals within metalcore. They really master, enhance it, especially in certain sections where it's right underneath a lot of the other music. Can't really describe it. It's just very well mixed and put together. So after the album cycle, unfortunately, all of the members quit, leaving Brett on his own. Now, Brett recruited some ex-members for about another year, but by the end of 2016, the band was finished. Now, to me, this is a real shame because I only discovered this band during this 2015 album cycle. It has become one of my favourite albums of all time from any band. Genuinely one of my top 10 records of all time. And I've since gone on to obviously listen back through all their records and discover some really awesome music. Overall, I think Buried in Verona is a very sad story. Very tumultuous time, loads of member changes, clear carnage all throughout the career of the band. Somehow, despite all of the carnage of all of these member changes, have managed to hone a sound that was unique, very special, and at some of the best Australian metalcore that I've ever heard. This is genuinely one of my 2 or 3 favourite metalcore albums of all time, and I'd always hoped after the breakup, like many bands, a couple of years later they may re-emerge, but it's only thanks to doing this video and really looking into all of the member changes over the years that I find that now, unfortunately, that's pretty unlikely to ever happen. It's a shame because Buried in Verona really are one of the best metalcore bands of all time. They went right under the radar, never really took off anywhere else other than in Australia, and we're unlikely to see them produce another album. Now, in the last video we talked about how 6am peaked with their final album Prayers for the Blessed in 2016, and that was a really good time to end things because they peaked. But for Buried in Verona, it feels like they had so much more potential, and they'd only really found their very best sound on the last album. And if it weren't for all of these member changes, they probably could have gone on to produce many, many more classics. So that was a slightly more sad ending to this video, but Buried in Verona, go and check them out if you don't know them because they are amazing. Now please do like and subscribe to the channel because we're trying to grow this thing as much as humanly possible. I'm going to be dropping a full Download Festival vlog as I'm actually going to Download with Bleed again. I'm going to be helping them out, recording the entire thing, and I'm going to be vlogging the full weekend. I'm really, really excited for that. There will be more of these ranked videos dropping every Sunday. I'm actually recording several today because I'm going to be at Download. I'm not going to be able to record them. But other than that, like and subscribe as I said, and I'll see you all very soon. Peace.